Good evening. In 1968, Fortune magazine declared for the first time that there was an American billionaire. In fact, there were two. The second richest man in the country was J. Paul Getty. Getty's fortune emanated from the oil industry, and a lot of his companies were privately held, which means he didn't have to disclose financial information. So it was hard to determine his exact net worth. But Fortune estimated that Getty was likely worth right around $1 billion. Getty was rich, but one man was even richer. That man was Howard Hughes. Like Getty, Hughes's fortune emanated from the oil industry, and the majority of his companies were also privately held. So again, it was hard to determine Hughes's exact net worth. But Fortune estimated that Hughes was worth upwards of $1.3 billion. Put it another way, Hughes was worth 30% more than his nearest competitor. From an early age, the question was, how would Hughes spend his vast fortune? Welcome and good evening. My name is Jeffrey Richardson, and I am the executive director of the McFaddin-Ward House. I want to thank you for coming here tonight. Before we begin, just a few minor housekeeping things for you. I like to talk. I like to hear myself talk, so get comfortable. There are two restrooms into the back hallway, right where you came in. We also have the emergency exit where you came in. We have another emergency exit here as well. And of course, please silence your cell phones. We have several upcoming events here at the museum I'd like to make you aware of. We have lectures on October 9. This is, of course, the start of our fall lecture series. It seems very disingenuous when it's 90 degrees outside to call this our fall lecture series. But our lectures will continue on October 9th with Shelley Kelly and Judge Brannick on the 1900 Galveston Storm. On November 13th with James Delgado on the Great Museum of the Sea. We have music events on October 17th with Jimmy Simmons and friends. On November 7th with Midlife Crisis. And of course, we have the holiday open house on December 6th and 7th. Because of the generosity and support of the Mamie McFaddin-Ward Heritage Foundation, everything that we're able to do here at the museum is mission-free. So the things that we've just mentioned, all of our house tours, everything that we do here at the organization is admission-free, and that is due to the generosity of the Mamie McFaddin-Ward Heritage Foundation. I would also like to thank the board of directors of the museum. They provide us with the guidance and oversight to allow us to accomplish our mission. Several members of the board are here tonight. Ms. Martha Hicks is here. Ms. Leslie Wilson is here. And I also want to thank Ms. Ida McFadden-Pyle, who is also here with us tonight. So thank you very much. And of course, I want to thank every single one of you. I appreciate you coming out here on a Thursday night. I certainly will not get you out by the time football starts, so just get comfortable, okay? Today, we are here to discuss Howard Hughes and the Creation of Modern Hollywood, the title of a book that I published on this topic. It is the first and only book that examined Hughes's impact on the motion picture industry. A household name for much of the 20th century, Hughes is largely forgotten today. If he is remembered, it is often for his eccentricities and self-enforced isolation. But Hughes was truly a Renaissance man who had a major impact on several fields, including electronics, finance, military defense, and gaming. His impact on the motion picture industry, however, is probably the least known and the least understood aspect of his remarkable life. Simply put, Howard Hughes was one of the most important movie producers during the golden age of cinema. At a time when filmmaking was tightly controlled and highly formulaic, Hughes used his enormous wealth to challenge the dictates and restrictions that define the motion picture industry. Tackling subjects that were explicitly forbidden, he pushed the boundaries of on-screen sex and violence. He also pioneered production and marketing techniques that were revolutionary, including the multi-million-dollar blockbuster and the promotion of Scandal. His tenure as a studio mogul also led to the end of the entire studio system. Again, Hughes was one of the most important producers in Hollywood history, but to truly understand Hughes, we first have to understand his wealth and the opportunities that it afforded him. Howard Robard Hughes Jr. was born in 1905, a little over an hour away in Humble, Texas. He was the only child of Howard Robard Hughes Sr. and Aline Hughes. Big Howard, as his father was known, sought his fortune in the booming oil industry, and the family bounced around from oil town to oil town. Big Howard, like many others, grew frustrated with the inability for traditional drills to dig deep enough to tap into reserves he was certain existed under the ground. Heavy cable tool bits were initially used for drilling. They were basically lifted and dropped, pounding the earth. The rotary bits with a fishtail design that replaced them were an improvement as they ground layers of rock, but they often broke apart when encountering harder formations. Big Howard theorized that a bit with cutters that rolled on the bottom instead of dragging like the fishtail bit did would eliminate the slow and costly drilling of harder formations. His prototype featured 2 cones and 166 cutting edges. The SH rotary rock drill bit, which came to be known as the Hughes rock bit or the Hughes roller bit, became the basis for the Hughes Tool Company based in Houston. The advertisement on the left from 1914 shows the revolutionary bit. In a stroke of financial genius, the bits were not sold, but rather leased to Wells, so Hughes Tool was always in control of the bit and always making money. Sheer genius, proclaimed William Stamps Farish, president of Standard Oil. It was highway robbery, of course, but genius all the same. Within 10 years, the Hughes drill bit was being used in 75% of the world's oil wells. Big Howard worked long hours, which left the raising of Howard Jr. to his mother, Aline, who was a hypochondriac and a germaphobe, traits that she passed on to her son. Despite this, Hughes's childhood appeared to be relatively normal. It was one of love and wealth, but certainly not opulence. But Hughes's world came crashing down when his mother passed away when he was only 16 years old. 2 years later, his father passed away. Hughes was still a minor, according to Texas law, so he petitioned the court to be named an adult. Hughes also moved to take full control of his father's company by purchasing interests owned by family and friends that he did not inherit. Quote, "The thing I knew was that I would never be able to get along with my relations, and that's why I was determined to buy them out and go it alone. If I hadn't been a brash kid, I never would have had any such idea, and I don't advise other brash kids to do what I did. I'll admit I didn't realize what hazards faced me, so maybe what I didn't know couldn't hurt," end quote. So by the time he was only 18 years old, Howard Hughes was the sole owner of the Hughes Tool Company. The company was the goose that laid the golden egg. Sales rose from just under $3 million in 1924, the year Hughes assumed control, to $117 million in 1956. The company was, in the words of one magazine, one of the finest moneymakers ever devised by the mind of man. Hughes used the proceeds of Hughes Tool to expand his business empire. A notable example was the Hughes Aircraft Company, which was born out of Hughes's love of aviation, and it grew to become the largest manufacturer in the United States of electronic equipment for the military. Revenue exceeded $500 million annually at its peak. Hughes also came to own 78% of TWA Airlines, which he eventually sold in the 1960s for $546 million, which was the largest amount ever paid outright to a single individual in the history of American finance up to that point. Hughes also came to own over $300 million in Las Vegas real estate, including the Desert Inn, Frontier, Sands, Landmark, the North Las Vegas Airport, and what would become the entire town of Summerlin. As noted, by 1968, Hughes was a billionaire and the richest man in America. Hughes had the world at his disposal, and the one thing that he did not want to do was personally run his father's company. Although he would never be too far removed from company operations, Hughes was smart enough to hire capable executives and let them run Hughes Tool. Noah Dietrich, Hughes's accountant and right-hand man during the first half of Hughes's life, privately noted that if Hughes left Hughes Tool alone, he would never go broke, regardless of what he spent his money on. The profits were so much, Hughes simply could not spend them quick enough. So, in the aftermath of his parents' death, Hughes confided to an associate what he hoped to do with his life and fortune. Quote, "My first objective is to become the world's #1 golfer. Second, the top aviator. And third, I want to become the world's most famous motion picture producer." End quote. Hughes spent a good bit of his early 20s playing golf, and he was actually quite good. He won several amateur tournaments in Southern California, where he relocated, and he may have been the first person to use a motion picture camera to film and study his swing. Hughes was dedicated, and he put in the work, but seemingly a lack of natural talent meant he was unable to become the world's best golfer. Hughes thus turns his attention to goal number 2, becoming the top aviator. Hughes had been enamored with aviation since taking his first flight with his father when he was 14 years old. By his early 20s, he secured a pilot's license and was rated to fly various types of aircraft. In 1932, Hughes disappeared for several months. During that time, an individual by the name of Charles Howard was hired as a pilot by American Airlines. The company eventually learned that Charles Howard was actually Howard Hughes. The company was forced to fire Hughes, not for his performance, but for lying on his application. While all of this was going on, Hughes was also tinkering with plane modifications, some of which he did himself, some of which he hired others to do at his direction. Hughes Aircraft Company was born out of these efforts. Then, over the course of 3 years, Hughes set every aviation record of consequence. In September of 1935, Hughes set the world speed record by traveling 352 miles per hour in a plane that he was instrumental in developing. The previous world record was 314 miles per hour. The following year, Hughes set the transcontinental speed record by flying from Los Angeles to Newark in 9 hours. He broke his own record again in 1937, trimming the time to 7 hours. Other records set included from Miami to New York and Chicago to Los Angeles. Hughes then turned his attention to what was considered at the time to be aviation's greatest record. That was circumnavigating the globe. Wiley Post had set the record in 1931 at 8.5 days. In 1935, Post was killed in a crash in Alaska trying to shorten his time. Western icon Will Rogers accompanied Post on the attempt, and he also died in the crash. In 1938, Hughes used a modified Lockheed 14 to travel 14,716 miles around the world in a mere 3 days and 19 hours, shattering Post's record. When Hughes landed in Brooklyn after completing the around-the-world flight, he was a national hero. 1.5 million people celebrated Hughes in a ticker-tape parade that was the largest in New York history up to that point, even larger than the parade for Charles Lindbergh a few years earlier. Hughes was presented with the Harmon Trophy, given to the world's outstanding aviator in 1936 and 1938. He received the Collier Trophy in 1938, which was given by the U.S. National Aeronautical Association for the greatest achievement in aviation. He was awarded a special Congressional Gold Medal, the most distinguished civilian award presented by the American government, in 1939 for advancing the science of aviation and thus bringing great credit to his country throughout the world. Life magazine proclaimed him Hero Hughes. Having conquered the world of aviation, Hughes was left with number 3 on his list, the world's most famous motion picture producer. In the movie business, it is said the only job that requires no qualifications is that of a producer. All a producer needs is money. Hughes had that and more. But when Hughes moved to Hollywood in 1925, he was forced to confront a ruthless and cutthroat business organization. The term Hollywood studio system, or the golden age of Hollywood, is used to describe the motion picture industry from roughly the 1920s to the 1960s. But while the term studio is used, the period was dominated not by studios, but rather large national corporations that owned production studios along with other subsidiaries, including distribution companies and theater chains. Films have basically always been made the same way. The production company creates the film, the distributor then wholesales the film from a producer to an exhibitor, and finally the exhibitor presents the film to paying customers. There were a lot of companies in the early days of the industry, but as the cost and technical proficiency of making movies increased, especially with the advent of sound, a lot of smaller companies went out of business or were bought out. By the 1930s, there were 8 corporations that dominated the industry: the Big Five and the Little Three. The Big Five, as they came to be known, were Paramount, MGM, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, and RKO Radio Pictures. Universal, Columbia, and United Artists were called the Little Three. All of the Big Five were vertically integrated. They had subsidiaries dedicated to production, distribution, and exhibition. In other words, they controlled the films that they made from the script to the screen. The Little Three lacked theater chains, so they were not fully integrated and not as powerful. At their peak, these 8 corporations controlled a combined 95% of all industry revenue. This was one of the most potent oligopolies in United States corporate history. A monopoly is when one company dominates and thus controls an industry. An oligarchy is when several companies dominate and control. Both can be considered an illegal constraint of trade in the United States, and the government can step in and force the company or companies to break up. The executives that ran the Big Five were terrified that the government would do just that. So they did everything in their power to eliminate government intervention. And they believed that controversy of any type, on screen or off, would lead to greater scrutiny, which could lead to further oversight or even dissolution. So they did everything in their power to avoid controversy. Thus, in 1922, the studios established the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, the MPPDA, a trade organization that was designed to foster the common interest of those engaged in the motion picture industry by establishing and maintaining the highest possible moral and artistic standards in motion picture production. The MPPDA came to be known as the Hayes Office for Chief Censor Will Hayes. Hayes was the former chairman of the Republican Party and the former Postmaster General under President Warren G. Harding. According to Hayes, who came to be known as the dictator of the cinema and the little Napoleon of the movies, the responsibility for better pictures rested with those who made the pictures, i.e. producers. The MPPDA thus scrutinized motion pictures at every stage of development, from the writing of the script to the final cut. If the MPPDA thought anything was objectionable, they demanded that the unacceptable word or scene be removed. Hayes was quick to point out that the dictates of the MPPDA were not censorship in any sense of the word, because all changes were supposedly made voluntarily in the best interests of all parties. In other words, the MPPDA, the organization created by the industry to oversee the industry, was designed to reduce the threat of federal antitrust laws against the industry through voluntary or self-censorship. But because the Big Five controlled the industry, self-censorship was anything but voluntary. Going even further, in 1930, the MPPDA established the Motion Picture Production Code to make sure that no picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. The code explicitly, think about that today. The code explicitly stated what films could and could not do. So crimes against the law should never, quote, be presented in such a way as to throw sympathy with the crime as against law and justice or to inspire others with a desire for imitation, end quote. The code thus had specific rules governing the treatment of murder. Brutal killings were not to be presented in detail. And methods of crime, the use of firearms, should be restricted to essentials. In regards to sex, the code stated that, quote, the sanctity of the institution of marriage and the home shall be upheld. Pictures shall not infer that low forms of sex relationship are the accepted or common theme, end quote. Thus, excessive and lustful kissing was not allowed to be shown. Relationships between blacks and whites were not allowed to be shown. And nudity in fact or silhouette was never permitted. Besides censorship, another notable industry practice at the time that stifled competition and reduced film quality was the practice of block booking, or selling multiple films to a theater in a single unit. In other words, if an exhibitor wanted a particular film, a film with Shirley Temple, one that they knew was going to be popular, they had to buy the entire studio suite of films. They couldn't just pick the one film that they wanted to buy. They had to buy them all as a package, good or bad, in that particular regard. Because the Big Five controlled the industry, they set the rules, and you had to follow the rules if you wanted to play the game. This kept everyone in line, and it made it virtually impossible for outsiders to make a mark on the industry. But Howard Hughes was different, in large part because his wealth was different. To break into the industry, Hughes turned to a family friend. Ralph Graves was a nominally successful actor who knew Hughes's father. When Graves learned that Hughes was in Los Angeles and was interested in making movies, he approached Hughes with a story he was developing called Swell Hogan. The film was about a kind-hearted derelict who constantly did good deeds, such as helping orphans. Besides starring in it, Ralph Graves also wrote the movie and served as the de facto producer. Hughes provided the entire $80,000 budget to make the movie, and when it was completed in 1926, review audiences said it was terrible. It was so bad, no company was willing to distribute or exhibit the film. A commentator joked that Hughes would accept any reasonable offer on the film. Probably $1.25 would interest him if the bidder would pay express charges. Legend has it that Hughes personally burned all of the available prints. Today, Swell Hogan is classified as lost, like many other movies from the silent era. Not deterred, Hughes was determined to continue in the motion picture industry, so he established his own production company, the Cato Company, and as he did with Hughes' Tool, he hired capable executives to help him run it. With their help, the studio turned out a handful of mildly profitable films in the 1920s. One notable success was Two Arabian Nights, released in 1927 and directed by Louis Milestone. It was the story of two American soldiers in World War I who are captured by the Germans, escape, and in their adventures to get home, they both fall in love with an Arabian king's daughter. The film was a critical and financial success, with director Louis Milestone winning the first and only Academy Award for Best Director of a Comedy in 1929. Thereafter, it was just Best Director. They didn't split comedy and drama. The first film to officially recognize Hughes' contribution as a producer was The Racket in 1928, another critical and financial success. The tagline read, "Howard R. Hughes Presents." Beyond financing these early films, Hughes played virtually no role in their production. And Hughes really seemed to know very little about how films were actually made. Actress Mary Astor noted that when Hughes visited the set of Two Arabian Nights, he couldn't understand where the fourth wall was. And a notable screenwriter summed up the thoughts of many at the time when he described Hughes years later as the sucker with the money. Hughes was green, but as he had shown in the field of aviation, he was also a quick study. Even if he was not hands-on during his early productions, he was absorbing all he could on how movies were made. Having forgotten his early struggles, Hughes quickly came to believe that making money on movies was simple. If you made a small profit on an ordinary picture like the ones he had made, he could realize greater returns by just spending more money. Hughes also came to believe that directing was easy and something that he could do just as good as anybody else. The key for Hughes was finding the right project to test everything that he had supposedly learned. As noted, two of the greatest passions in Hughes's life were aviation and movies. He was inspired to bring them together after the success of the movie Wings in 1927, a World War I aviation adventure that won the first Academy Award for Best Picture. Around that time, director Marshall Nealon, who had worked with Hughes previously on Cato's first film, Everybody's Acting, in 1926, brought Hughes the story of two brothers in the British Royal Air Force during the First World War. both of whom are in love with the same woman. It was called Hell's Angels. Hughes loved the story and bought the rights, with Nealon slated to direct. Hughes spent over $500,000 acquiring or leasing 87 planes from Great Britain, Germany, France, and the United States. By the time production began, Hughes had assembled the largest private air force in the world. 8 separate locations were maintained across Southern California for the aerial sequences, including the main flying base in Van Nuys and a training camp in Inglewood, which is now the site of the Los Angeles International Airport. A total of 137 pilots, mainly stunt flyers and veterans of the First World War, were employed, along with a corresponding number of mechanics. Hughes also hired 26 aerial photographers to work on the film. The 2 lead male roles in Hughes' aerial epic went to Ben Lyon and James Hall. The only female lead of any consequence was given to Greta Nielsen, a Norwegian actress who had primarily played seductive roles in previous silent films. Production began in October of 1927. Hughes had been hands-off during his previous productions. But on this film, Hughes micromanaged all aspects of production, causing director Nealon to quit before filming even began. A second director who had a background in aviation was brought on board. He also found Hughes' meddling to be too much. And after only 2 months of production, he screamed at Hughes, "If you know so much about it, why don't you direct the damn thing yourself?" Hughes replied, "It's a good idea. I will." Howard Hughes was now a producer and a director. Hughes knew the success of the film was dependent on the aerial sequences. As director, he spent countless takes getting everything exactly right. The production was so exacting, it led to 3 aviation-related fatalities. 2 died off camera and 1 died on camera. Parts of the on-camera accident are actually included in the final film. When one pilot refused to attempt a stunt, Hughes decided he would do it himself. Hughes lost the control of the plane in midair, and it plummeled to the ground. A member of the crew was heard exclaiming, "My God, there goes $50 million in my job." Reports from the time noted that Hughes suffered only minor injuries, but in reality, he cracked his skull, and he was in a coma for 3 days. When he woke up, he was back in the director's chair the next day. On another occasion, a pilot was tasked with diving at a cliff to simulate attack on a machine gun nest. The pilot declared that the stunt was impossible, so Hughes again got in the cockpit. Hughes dove the plane at the wall of a canyon and pulled up at the last second possible. Everyone was astonished that he had pulled it off. The cast and crew were so transfixed, the cameraman stopped filming. Hughes was forced to do the stunt a second time. Filming was only supposed to take a few weeks, but it stretched into months. Several premiere dates were announced, but Hughes kept tinkering with the film, so it was not released. Finally, 2 years after production began, an opening was set for October of 1929. It appeared the film would finally be shown to the public at a cost of just under $2 million. A $1 million production was a rarity in the early years of the studio system. The Big Five, using their control over the industry, sought to reduce any unnecessary costs in an attempt to maximize profits. The bulk of the costs associated with production. So as a result, they tried to limit how much they spent on production. Most of the money came from exhibition, not production. And again, because they owned their own theater chains and because they employed practices such as block booking, a market existed even for the most mediocre of films. As a result, high-budget productions carried a substantially higher risk of failure than low-budget movies. Corporate executives thus came to see production as an inconvenient necessity and thus sought to limit production cost. Limiting production cost, however, was contrary to Hughes's belief that spending more money meant you would make more money. But just as Hell's Angels was ready to be released, a revolution engulfed the industry. Sound on film dated back to the advent of moving pictures, but technical limitations delayed its implementation. Al Jolson spoke a few words in 1927 in The Jazz Singer, And the following year, the first all-talking feature, The Lights of New York, was released. Both were financially successful. Silent films would continue to be made for several years, but sound was clearly the future of the industry. Hughes always wanted to make Hell's Angels, and he always wanted it to be an epic. He wanted it to be a film that set the standard for the genre and was talked about for generations. A silent film would be easily overlooked. It had to be a talkie. So Hughes resumed production in September 1929 to turn a lavish silent film into a lavish talking film. Luckily, sound effects could be added easily to the aerial footage. It was the actors that had to be completely reshot. One major issue was Norwegian actress Greta Nielsen, whose accent was really thick. Like many other silent film stars, sound basically ruined her career. 100 girls auditioned for her replacement. Hughes ultimately cast a 19-year-old with platinum blonde hair named Jean Harlow. Production had gone on for so long, it had become a joke within the industry. During the early days of the Great Depression, cameramen liked to greet one another with, "Are you out of work or are you on Hell's Angels?" Critics spoke of a man who was celebrating his 105th birthday, and they said he was the only living person who could remember when Hell's Angels production had begun. They even talked of young men who went to work on Hell's Angels but ultimately gave up their jobs to their grandchildren. Production finished for a second time in December of 1929. Over 2.25 million feet of film were shot. The average director shoots around 10 times more film than they use. Howard Hughes consumed over 150 times more. For example, there is a shot in the final film which shows a brief close-up of a winch pulling a cable. It takes up a total of 9 feet of film, but to get it exactly right, Hughes shot 18,000 feet of film. When post-production was completed in April of 1930, the film cost $2.9 million, making it the most expensive film ever made up to that point. Not content to simply release the film, Hughes staged an equally elaborate opening in May at Grauman's Chinese Theater in Los Angeles. Airplanes flew overhead and furnished a display of fireworks. Hollywood Boulevard was lined every few yards for over a mile with huge sun arc lights. The neighboring hills were dotted with fan-shaped clusters of multicolored searchlights. In addition to floodlights, over 200 giant searchlights were used in the display. The Los Angeles Times reported that it was the biggest crowd ever for a premiere in the city. Reviewers were almost all positive. The Los Angeles Times said it was a magnificent picture, while Time magazine declared it an astounding achievement. A World War I veteran who was reviewing the film said it actually shows you the things the gang who flew at the front has been trying to explain for 12 years. Polls listed Hughes among the best directors of the year. Hell's Angels was also reportedly a huge financial success, which appeared to prove Hughes's theory on spending. More importantly, the supposed success of Hell's Angels forced Hollywood executives to abandon their constraints on production. So-called prestige films with huge budgets would become industry norm in the 1930s. The trend culminated with Gone with the Wind in 1939, one of Hollywood's most celebrated pictures and the film that finally eclipsed the record-breaking cost of Hell's Angels. But internal company documents show that the film actually lost around $1.5 million. But that was never publicly disclosed. In fact, Hughes loudly heralded the film as a huge moneymaker, which meant that Hughes was a financial genius. Like his aviation exploits, Hughes was depicted in the media as someone who used his vast fortune to break the rules, a millionaire man of the people. Hughes' manipulation of the media, or more accurately, Hughes' willingness to blatantly lie, became a hallmark of his life and legend. Hughes had come a long way quickly. Since early on, not trying to figure out where the fourth wall was, he had clearly made his mark on the industry. But spending his own money was one thing. Flaunting the production code was another. Hughes produced several films after Hell's Angels, but he did not take an active role in their production. His next film of significance was entitled Scarface, which incorporated many aspects of the life of noted Chicago gangster Al Scarface Capone. Hughes hired director Howard Hawks and cast Paul Muni in the lead role. Production began in June of 1931. The MPPDA, the industry censorship body, was concerned when they learned of Hughes' latest project. The MPPDA never liked gangster films because they seemed to glorify crime. A story about Capone was even more controversial because up to that point, the government had failed to successfully prosecute the noted gangster. The MPPDA worried that a gangster film about Capone would upset government officials, which could lead to federal oversight. Prior to production, the MPPDA sought changes to the film's script. When the final film was screened, additional changes were demanded. After countless meetings and correspondence, Hughes relented somewhat and agreed to make some changes. He softened the ending of the movie, he added a theme of gun control, and he altered the title to include the subtitle, Shame of a Nation, so as not to glorify criminality. He also weakened the allusion to an incestuous relationship between the lead character and his sister. Hughes made those changes to placate the MPPDA, the industry's internal organization. But independent censorship boards also existed across the country at the local and state level. A film had to be submitted to those boards to be shown in their jurisdiction. Approval by the MPPDA did not guarantee approval by the local boards. The most powerful censorship board at the time was in New York. When Scarface was submitted for approval in their district, the New York censors denied the film, noting that it was a story of a man who committed commercialized murder with brutal indifference. He escaped punishment by perjury, vicious coercion of witnesses, and the corrupt use of the laws of the nation. He also, and this is my favorite quote that I found in my research, he also, quote, loved his sister, not as a sister, but as a woman, end quote. I love that. I love that. I'm sorry. In the end, the state's report said the film was denied approval because it was indecent, inhuman, immoral, and will tend to incite to crime and corrupt morals. Hughes made minor edits, but refused to make all of the required cuts to satisfy the local censors. So the film continued to be denied in New York. Similar battles were taking place across the country. Studios typically tried to get a film approved everywhere before it was exhibited anywhere. Again, they were trying to limit controversy. But Hughes was not a studio, and he had no such concerns. He quickly grew tired of the battle to get the film approved in local jurisdictions. So he decided to go ahead and premiere the film at Grauman's Chinese Theater in March of 1932, as he continued to negotiate, or more accurately defy, local censorship boards. And since Los Angeles did not have a censorship board, Hughes premiered the original, uncut version of the film. The LA Times said it had a bang-up cast, and it was by far the goriest, most machine gun-laden of the epics of the underworld. Reviewers were generally positive, with the press highlighting the fight to get the film approved, the exact type of negative publicity that the industry wanted desperately to avoid. The MPPDA was furious. Back in New York, the film was still banned, so Hughes threatened a lawsuit. Hughes declared, quote, "It becomes a serious threat to the freedom of honest expression in America when self-styled guardians of the public welfare, as personified by our film censor boards, lend their influence to abortive efforts of selfish and vicious interests to suppress a motion picture simply because it depicts the truth about conditions which constitute front-page news. In order to obtain justice in the case of Scarface, I intend to file suit immediately in the New York state courts to restrain the New York censors from further interference with the exhibition of this picture in its original version," end quote. If Hughes followed through with his threats, it would be the first time a major motion picture producer would go to court to oppose film censorship. Negotiations on required changes continued, and the two sides finally came to an agreement in May of 1932 before the lawsuit was actually filed. Hughes did make a few minor changes, but the censors certainly gave in. The film still violated the tenets of the Motion Picture Production Code as it related to violence, but the industry and powerful censorship boards, like the one in New York, agreed to approve the film, seemingly to silence Hughes. No one had directly challenged them before, and they worried that their stranglehold over the industry would weaken if others followed Hughes's suit. Better to quiet one than to embolden others. Hughes said, quote, "I regard this not only as a personal victory, but as a real triumph for the independence of the screen," end quote. For the record, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Film Daily, and the National Board of Review all named Scarface among the best pictures of the year 1932. Today, it is considered a classic of the gangster genre of the 1930s. Determined to strengthen their control over the industry, including over independents like Hughes, the MPPDA responded in 1934 by amending the production code to require all films made thereafter to obtain an official seal of approval, which would appear on screen at the outset of each picture. Failure to obtain and abide by the mandates of the seal would result in substantial and effective penalties. One final note on the film. Al Capone was asked about Scarface and other gangster movies in an interview in 1932. He said, quote, "I think these gangster pictures should be stopped. They are bad for the kiddies," end quote. Nice guy. He was a nice guy. Howard Hawks, not Howard Hughes, directed Scarface. And given its success, Hughes re-signed Hawks to a two-picture deal. The first production in the deal was a story based on Billy the Kid, entitled The Outlaw. Newcomer Jack Butel was cast as Billy. For the female love interest Rio, Hughes auditioned hundreds of actresses, most of them unknowns. He finally settled on a part-time receptionist from Van Nuys, California, named Jane Russell. Hughes signed her to a 7-year contract at $50 a week. Good money at the time. Production on the film began in November of 1940. 2 weeks in, Hughes and Hawks were fighting over the budget. Hughes actually wanted Hawks to spend more, but the director, who had a financial stake in the film, thought additional spending was unnecessary. When Hawks refused Hughes's dictates, Hawks was fired. This may be the first and only time in motion picture history a director was fired for not spending enough money. As he had done on Hell's Angels, Hughes took over as director. Production concluded in February of 1941, with reshoots taking place in March. Given Hughes' past experience as a director, filming went smooth. The MPPDA saw the script prior to filming, and they objected to violence in the film and to suggestions of an illicit sexual relationship between the main characters, including a notable scene in a hayloft. As he had done previously, Hughes agreed to make changes, but ultimately did not do so. And the MPPDA had no idea when they were evaluating the script that the objectionable scenes would be played by the voluptuous Jane Russell in a low-cut dress. According to legend, Hughes even went so far as to use his knowledge of engineering to design a special bra to further accentuate Russell's breasts. Interesting, Russell both confirmed and denied the story over the years. The first screening for the MPPDA took place in March of 1941, upon completion of principal photography. Censor Joseph Breen, the number 2 at the MPPDA, was horrified. Quote, "In my more than 10 years of critical examination of motion pictures, I have never seen anything quite so unacceptable as the shots of the breasts of the character Rio. Throughout almost half the picture, the girl's breasts, which are quite large and prominent, are shockingly emphasized, and in almost every instance are very substantially uncovered," unquote. The two sides battled over the required cuts. Hughes would agree to make changes, but would not follow through. In one instance, Hughes removed a shot, but the replacement was deemed even more unacceptable. Months of negotiations finally resulted in a version that both sides would agree to. The Outlaw was granted the industry seal of approval. But when Hughes submitted the film to the local censorship boards, they refused to approve it. 20th Century Fox, the film's distributor, backed out, fearful of the negative publicity. As he had done with Scarface, Hughes decided to open the film independently, this time in San Francisco in January of 1943, as World War II raged overseas. Billboards around town showed Russell in a haystack with a byline that stated, "Sex has not been rationed." Obvious reference to the ongoing war effort on the home front. Local police would not allow the film to be shown until the billboards were removed. The film finally premiered in San Francisco in February of 1943, 2 years after initial production ended. Critics panned the movie. San Francisco News said the film should have been kept locked up for another 2 years. Almost all reviewers commented on Russell, or more accurately, her figure. The critic for the LA Times wrote that, quote, Miss Russell's acting talent is undetermined, but then that's not exactly what's emphasized in the picture, end quote. The film played in San Francisco and only San Francisco for a few weeks. It then disappeared from public view as Hughes fought censorship boards across the country. As always, Hughes agreed to make a few changes, but then refused to do so. It's important to note, again, why a typical producer had to fall in line. First, they needed their film to be exhibited. Movies cost a lot of money, and no producer could afford to simply sit on a movie. The studio backing the film also wanted to get as much financially out of the film as possible. Second, a producer did not want to get a reputation for producing immoral films. This could lead to fewer opportunities and even blacklisting. Just about every producer felt these constraints except Howard Hughes. He had the resources to make a $1 million film with no expectation that it return a profit. And he truly did not care about his reputation within the industry. So months turned into years, and the film was still not approved in states across the country. A lot of the old censorship records are still available. A typical file is only a few pages long. The files for The Outlaw read like novels. Hughes would make a minor alteration and submit the new version to be reviewed. The censors would deny and state the reasons why. Hughes would make another minor cut and resend. The censors would deny. The process would continue daily for years. This happened for so long. In many locales, Hughes simply wore down the censors. Their demands diminished over time, and in 1946, the film was approved in New York and other key areas without substantial alterations. But a new issue emerged. The industry seal of approval required that all advertising also had to be approved. Even before the film finished production, Jane Russell was placed at the center of a huge marketing campaign. She was a pinup girl before anyone had ever had a chance to see her on screen. As Hughes prepped the film for its national release, he flooded the market with sultry images of Russell. Almost every picture focused on her breast and often exposed a lot of cleavage. One ad you see pictured on the right asked, "What are the 2 great reasons for Jane Russell's rise to stardom?" Another double entendre read simply, "Here they are." Moving beyond the page, for the film's exhibition in Pasadena, California, Hughes hired a skywriting plane to fly over the city. After spelling out The Outlaw, he drew 2 huge circles side by side and placed a dot in the center of each of them. For many individuals, both in and out of the motion picture industry, Hughes had gone way too far. In April of 1946, the industry watchdog group, which now called itself the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA, formally rebuked Hughes. It was the first time the organization had ever taken such action. Hughes responded by filing a $5 million suit against the organization. And he did file it this time, and it was the first time the organization had been challenged legally. While the suit made its way through the courts, the film was actually exhibited in a few places across the country. On more than one occasion, the exhibitor was arrested on charges of indecency for showing the film. On almost every occasion, the exhibitor was found not guilty in court. Hughes, however, lost his battle with the MPAA. Hughes's lawsuit took issue with the requirements of the seal, but the presiding judge basically ruled that if Hughes wanted a seal of approval for his film, he had to abide by the requirements of the seal. He could not pick and choose what parts he wanted to follow. The judge also noted that the lawsuit appeared to be an attempt to garner publicity for the film. The industry may have won in court, but they still had to deal with Hughes. Like he had done with the film itself, Hughes would make minor changes to the advertising and resubmit. The cycle continued. The director of the MPAA's advertising division wrote in a confidential letter that he was so tired of the battle that he was now willing to approve anything that, quote, I could later justify without completely stultifying my own conscience, end quote. as with the censorship boards, Hughes wore them down, and advertising acceptable to both sides was finally approved. So 5 years after production concluded and 3 years after it was shown briefly in San Francisco, the film was released on a large scale in 1946. The battle surrounding the film cast a large shadow over the industry. The tenets that voluntarily bound the major studios, which included carefully cultivating an image of unity and respectability, were slowly unraveling in the face of an independent producer who had the resources and fortitude to do whatever he wanted, regardless of the consequences for himself or for the industry. An officer of the MPAA lamented, quote, "It is another instance of what Mr. Hughes's conduct has brought upon the industry," end quote. By directly challenging the MPAA in court, Hughes opened the floodgate that culminated with the United States Supreme Court ruling in 1952 that motion pictures are included within the free speech and free press guarantees of the First and 14th Amendments. Although the production code limped into the 1960s, Hughes's conduct surrounding Scarface and The Outlaw helped bring about an end to movie censorship. After The Outlaw, Hughes stepped away from the industry for several years. It was during this time that he made national headlines with The Spruce Goose. Not made out of spruce, that's a different lecture. From his entry into the industry, there was always speculation that Hughes would use his wealth not to make individual films, but to buy an entire studio. Records indicate that Hughes explored the possibility on several occasions. Finally, in 1948, Hughes purchased RKO. RKO Radio Pictures was one of Hollywood's big five studios, along with Paramount, MGM, 20th Century Fox, and Warner Brothers. RKO was formed in 1928 when the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, gained control of the Film Booking Offices of America, a distributor, and the Keith Albee Orpheum Theater chain, an exhibitor. RKO was thus vertically integrated at its birth. The impetus for the merger was the introduction of sound to the motion picture industry. RKO became a subsidiary of RCA, which also owned the NBC radio network. Executives hoped to forge an alliance between radio and movies, so RKO Productions were trade-named Radio Pictures. To reinforce the concept, RKO adopted as its logograph a giant radio tower perched atop a world beeping out its signal. The other majors came to be known for a very specific type of film. For example, Paramount was known for comedy, Warner for social realism, Fox for musicals, and Universal for horror. RKO, however, did not have a unique identity and produced a very diverse slate of film from year to year. Notable films produced by RKO: Cimarron, the Western Epic in 1931, which won an Academy Award for Best Picture; Flying Down to Rio, 1933, which introduced the world to the duo of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers; Of Human Bondage in 1934, the film that made Bette Davis a star; Alfred Hitchcock's Notorious in 1946, the Christmas classic It's a Wonderful Life, also in 1946, a few of John Ford's movies, including Fort Apache, 1948, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, 1949, but the two films that RKO is best remembered for are King Kong in 1933 and Orson Welles' masterpiece Citizen Kane in 1941. Hughes purchased controlling interest, 24% of RKO in 1948 for a cost of approximately $9 million. Accountant Noah Dietrich said Hughes buying a studio was like turning a kid loose in a candy store. Hughes immediately made his presence felt. He stopped production on several projects and he scrapped others. Most high-level executives left the company. An RKO veteran noted that, quote, working for Hughes was like taking the ball in a football game and running 4 feet only to find that the coach was tackling you from behind, end quote. For the most part, the films produced at RKO under Hughes' tenure were unremarkable. But Hughes, the studio mogul, was revolutionary for different reasons. One reason had to deal with how movies were marketed, or more accurately, how scandals surrounding movies were handled. Robert Mitchum was one of RKO's biggest stars when Hughes assumed control of the studio. Mitchum had just completed work on the film Rachel and the Stranger. Loretta Young played Rachel and Mitchum played the stranger. When in the early hours of September 1st, 1948, Mitchum was arrested on felony narcotics possession in Los Angeles for smoking marijuana with actress Lila Leeds and others in a home that was being watched by police. When Mitchum was being processed at the county jail, the booking officer formally asked the star for his occupation. "Former actor," replied Mitchum. A typical studio would have distanced itself from Mitchum immediately. A morals clause in actors' contracts would have allowed the studio to release Mitchum with no financial obligations. Hughes, however, thought the controversy was free publicity and a great way to promote Mitchum's latest film, which was rushed into the theaters. Hughes even went so far as to pay for Mitchum's defense, and he objected loudly and publicly when his star was found guilty and sentenced to a year in prison. But instead of letting Mitchum do his time in prison quietly and letting the scandal blow over, Hughes arranged for a Life magazine to do an article on Mitchum while he was in prison. The accompanying picture showed Mitchum working in his prison uniform. Mitchum did not appear to mind the publicity, joking with the reporter that, quote, he never felt better in his life. That farm's just like a weekend in Palm Springs. Great place to get into shape, end quote. Mitchum was especially proud to report that he was batting .800 on the prison softball team. Hughes' strategy worked, and Rachel and the Stranger became one of the most successful films for RKO in 1948. As for Mitchum, his career thrived. He was not a former actor, as he noted on the night of his arrest, but rather an even bigger star, a rare example at the time of a public scandal increasing an actor's popularity. In fact, what was much more typical is what happened to Lila Leeds, the up-and-coming actress who was arrested alongside Mitchum. Her career was ruined, and she literally was never hired again, except, ironically, for an exploitation film about a girl whose career was ruined by marijuana. Hughes' controversial and groundbreaking promotion of films continued the following year. In 1948, RKO sent Ingrid Bergman to Italy to star in the film Stromboli with director Roberto Rossellini. Bergman was a true international star. During the course of her career, she won 3 Academy Awards, 2 Emmys, 4 Golden Globes, and a Tony Award. As the 1940s were coming to an end, she was at the height of her career, having starred in Casablanca, 1942, For Whom the Bell Tolls, 1943, The Bells of St. Mary's, 1945, Notorious, 1946, and most recently as the title character in Joan of Arc in 1948. Bergman's image was of sweetness and purity. Her director for Stromboli was Roberto Rossellini, a giant in the history of European cinema. He is known for his realism and the humanity that he brought to his work. Rumors began to surface during production that the captivating Swedish actress and the fiery Italian director were romantically involved, which in and of itself may have been a problem, but the real problem was that they were both married. And Bergman had such a wholesome reputation in the minds of American viewers. After all, she played a nun in The Bells of St. Mary and a virgin saint in Joan of Arc. A typical studio would go into damage control. But when Bergman's publicist confided to Hughes that not only were the rumors true, but that she was also pregnant, Hughes promised not to tell anyone. And then he immediately called gossip columnist Luella Parsons. She published the story the next day. Parsons noted that, quote, the story created a sensation, the greatest ever, I believe, in relation to a story about a movie personality, end quote. As he had done with Mitchum, Hughes thought the controversy was a great way to publicize the film regardless of the consequences. For Bergman, the scandal took a tremendous toll on her personal life and her professional career. She was even denounced as a powerful influence for evil on the floor of the United States Senate. Her career stalled in America for many years. She was forced to move to and work in Europe, finally returning to Hollywood 7 years later with the film Anastasia in 1956, for which she won her second Oscar. As for Stromboli, Hughes implemented a marketing campaign that made parallels between the film and the controversy surrounding it. Hughes even went so far as to recut the film without Rossellini's knowledge to play up those elements. Advertisements also evoked the affair, with text proclaiming raging island, raging passions, and this is it. Despite the publicity, the film was a financial disappointment. Looking beyond the initial test cases, Hughes had unleashed a force greater than he could ever imagine. As one studio executive said in the aftermath of the Bergman affair, quote, "I can tell you it hit Hollywood with the greatest impact I've ever witnessed. That's all anybody is talking about," end quote. And that was the point. People in and out of the industry in America and around the world were talking about the film. The publicity was unparalleled, and the embrace of scandal unleashed by Howard Hughes, the studio mogul, would eventually become industry-wide. A few years later, in 1952, Hughes found himself at the center of a different type of controversy. The Las Vegas Story starred Vincent Price, Jane Russell, and Victor Mature in a tale of love and murder set in Sin City. The controversy was again off-screen, but this time it had to do with a missing credit. The screenplay was written by Paul Jericho, someone who had written over a dozen films since the 1930s. The problem was Jericho was a lifelong communist. He was eventually subpoenaed before the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, where he refused to admit his involvement or name names. Hughes responded by firing Jericho, citing the moral clause in his contract, the same clause he refused to invoke when Mitchum was arrested. Hughes even went so far as to make a rare public appearance on April 1st, 1952, at a meeting of the American Legion Hollywood Post number 43, where he railed against communism in the motion picture industry, repeating the often said line at the time, "If there were only one, that would be too many." Hughes removed Jericho's name from the credits of the film, but Hughes did not have the authority to do that. A contract between the Screenwriters Guild and the Producers Guild stated that writing credits were to be determined by the Screenwriters Guild. The Guild ruled that Jericho should be credited for the Las Vegas Story, but Hughes simply refused to do so. Hughes took the matter to court to affirm his right to fire Jericho and strip his writing credit. A blacklist had existed unofficially since 1947 when HUAC first investigated the industry, but nothing had ever been done legally. Hughes's actions were the first legal action brought by any major motion picture studio against any of the men or women who were subpoenaed by HUAC. The presiding judge ruled that Hughes was within his rights to fire Jericho and strip his credit because Jericho was clearly a communist and refused to cooperate with Congress. In other words, the Hollywood blacklist was not only legal, but it was morally right. A stunning precedent that allowed the blacklist, one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood history, to continue for years. One final film of note from RKO. The Conqueror in 1956, a film Hughes took an active role in producing, is one of the most infamous movies in Hollywood history. It is ostensibly based on the life of Asian warlord Genghis Khan, and to play the lead role, naturally, Hughes insisted on casting John Wayne, America's favorite cowboy. Because when I think of an Asian warlord, I think of John Wayne. The glamorous redhead, Susan Hayward, was cast as his prisoner and love interest. Hughes selected the area around St. George, Utah, to shoot the film. The area bordered the Nevada test site, where America tested atomic weapons during the early decades of the Cold War. In 1953 alone, the year before production took place in the region, 11 nuclear tests took place at nearby Yucca Flat, Nevada. The radioactive ash supposedly fell on a wide area, including St. George, which was 145 miles away. After on-site filming concluded, the cast and crew headed back to Los Angeles for interior studio scenes. 60 tons of dirt were taken from the site and shipped back to Hollywood for interior filming. Hughes, more than most, was aware of the potential danger. He had previously overseen a movie for RKO entitled Split Second, which came out in 1953, which addressed the danger of radiation in Nevada. When Hughes moved to Las Vegas years later, he spent considerable time and money trying to get the testing stopped. He even went so far as reportedly offering President Lyndon Johnson a $1 million bribe to stop atomic testing in Nevada. The Conqueror was actually profitable. It made $9 million and was the 11th most successful film of 1956. But the filming itself may have been catastrophic. Of the 220 people in the cast and crew, 91 contracted cancer by 1980. with half of the cancer victims dying of the disease. Director Dick Powell died of stomach cancer, January 1963. Susan Hayward contracted lung, then brain cancer, and died in March of 1975. John Wayne died of stomach cancer in June 1976. Some say Hughes was so guilt-ridden by the deaths surrounding the film, he later purchased the rights to the movies and kept it out of circulation for years, claims that are likely not true. But Hughes did acquire the rights to the film, and he personally watched it countless times in a darkened room as he slipped into madness. Maybe trying to figure out John Wayne as Genghis Khan made him go crazy, I'm not sure. But a direct line connecting the film to the cancer diagnoses will never be established. After all, John Wayne smoked 5 packs of unfiltered cigarettes a day. But the circumstantial evidence is strong, and the infamy surrounding the film is even stronger. As noted earlier, when Hughes was at RKO, there were 5 corporations that dominated the industry: Paramount, MGM, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, and RKO. Combined with the little 3 of Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, they controlled 95% of all industry revenue. Acting upon repeated complaints from independent producers and small theater owners, the United States Department of Justice initiated an antitrust case against the major studios in July of 1938. It was called the Paramount case, taking its name after the biggest defendant. Basically, the government argued that the vertical integration of the corporation, basically owning production, distribution, and exhibition, limited competition and was therefore a violation of antitrust laws. The studios were unified in their defense, and they were unified in their refusal to give in to the government's demands. Years of legal maneuvering ensued, with no clear indication of who might win or even what a victory might actually look like for either side. But finally, in 1948, the Supreme Court declared that the studios were guilty of violating antitrust laws. The court recommended, but did not immediately require, divorcing exhibition, divorcing theaters from production and distribution as the solution. The Justice Department sought voluntary cooperation from the companies to divest of their theater chains. But the companies refused to go along with the government's demands. The companies remained unified in their determination to continue fighting in the courts and using any other means available to them. Hughes was always an outsider within the Hollywood system, and he only worried about what was in his best interest. He realized that RKO was the weakest of the majors, and the studio would be brought on close to equal ground if divestiture was successfully enacted across the industry. More importantly, if production and distribution were split from exhibition, Hughes could sell one or the other component and likely make a profit. As such, Hughes was the first and initially the only studio head to voluntarily agree to spin off the studio's theater chain from its production operations. For others in the industry, with one studio agreeing to divest, all the others would ultimately have to do the same. Hughes's decision was one of the most monumental in the history of the film industry, effectively ending the studio system. Interestingly, in what initially appeared to be an attempt to strengthen his position in the industry after spinning off the theater chain, Hughes initially increased his ownership stake in the production studio, eventually becoming the first person to solely own one of the major Hollywood studios. But then, in 1955, Hughes unexpectedly sold all of his shares and left the industry for good. As quickly as he had arrived, he disappeared from Hollywood. And yes, Hughes made a profit selling off the components. Having played such an active role in the industry for decades, why has Hughes's impact on the industry been overlooked? Why is his name not mentioned alongside the likes of Darryl Zanuck, Jack Warner, David O. Selznick, and Louis B. Mayer? In part, it's because of his legacy within the industry is seen as primarily negative. It is also due to the fact that he was often viewed as an outsider who was simply playing Hollywood. Hughes was also overshadowed by his own success as an aviator, playboy, entrepreneur, casino mogul, and real estate tycoon. Surprisingly, Hughes is even remembered as a philanthropist for creating the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, one of the largest medical research foundations in the world. which, for the record, Hughes set up as a tax shelter. That is completely a different story for another lecture. But probably, more than anything else, the reclusive and strange way of how Hughes's life ended dramatically impacted all aspects of his legacy. As he got older, he suffered from severe pain from aviation accidents, which was coupled with degenerative loss of hearing, and likely several undiagnosed conditions, which may have included syphilis. As his physical condition deteriorated, he chose to shut himself off from the rest of the world. Beginning in the mid-1960s, he locked himself away in hotels where he communicated only with a handful of people. In 1967, he booked a floor at the Desert Inn in Las Vegas. When his reservation expired and he was asked to leave, Hughes countered by buying the hotel, which began his spree of $300 million investment in the Las Vegas area. Almost no one saw Hughes in the last years of his life. Robert Mayhew, a former FBI and CIA agent, was Hughes's right-hand man in the second part of his career, and Mayhew never once laid eyes on his employer. A struggling writer by the name of Clifford Irving took advantage of the situation by writing a memoir in 1972 he claimed had been commissioned by Hughes. Irving thought Hughes would refuse to come out of hiding to deny that the book was a fake. Hughes decided to stage a press conference via phone to deny it. In other words, Hughes did not come out of hiding. A variety of lawsuits hounded Hughes, so when he finally left Las Vegas, he continued to bounce from hotel to hotel, even from country to country. His physical condition deteriorated and went untreated. Hughes ultimately died in an airplane from Mexico to Texas in April of 1976. Kidney failure was the listed cause, but he was also malnourished, needles were broken in his arm, and he had long hair and fingernails. He did not leave a will, which led to years of court proceedings over his empire. Hughes had become a mythic figure, a cautionary tale. But we should not overlook his legacy, especially in Hollywood. Hughes was the independent producer who pioneered the million-dollar blockbuster and fought censors over on-screen violence and sex. As a mogul, he ended the studio system, promoted scandal, fought communists, and was the first person to ever completely own a major Hollywood studio. Every time you see a blockbuster with an astronomical production budget, now in excess of hundreds of millions of dollars, think of Hell's Angels. If a movie is filled with violence and sex, as virtually all of them are nowadays, remember Scarface and The Outlaw. As you are deciding which multiplex to attend, where movies from different studios are shown, consider the demise of the studio system. When you are bombarded with the latest celebrity scandal, a new one seems to happen every day, keep in mind the test cases of Robert Mitchum and Ingrid Bergman. And remember, it all began with Howard Hughes, the world's most famous motion picture producer. Thank you. We're going to take some questions. Anyone have any? We'll start kind of open the floor to questions. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the movie The Aviator starring? Are you familiar with the movie The Aviator starring Leo DiCaprio? And can you comment on how accurate the activities in the plot were?
The film, basically, he asked about The Aviator, as you heard, the film starring Leonardo DiCaprio, which was directed by Martin Scorsese, came out, I can't even remember, but at least 10 so years ago. That really focuses on his time, the early part of his career. It talks about Hell's Angels, so that's portrayed in the film. The grand premiere, the lavish premiere is depicted in the film as well. It's pretty accurate for a Hollywood biofilm. I do believe at the time period we're talking about, the end of the film, foreshadowing, well, sorry, I'm giving it away here, folks. The end of the film really kind of shows him starting to go and starting to kind of lose his mental capacities. I think they introduced that a little bit quicker than would have actually been evident to people, but overall it's a fairly accurate movie, but it really does focus more on his aviation time than really his Hollywood career, but it does talk about Hell's Angels. He had a relationship with Katharine Hepburn for many years, and it talks about that, for example. So overall, it's a pretty good film, and it's pretty accurate for a Hollywood biofilm. Yes, sorry, I think there was a question over here. Any other? Yeah, we have a question here. Oh, she's going to bring the microphone to you. Hold on one second.
I'm just curious what facilitated your interest in Howard Hughes and this specific part of his life.
Thank you very much. I read a biography of Howard Hughes early on when I was just becoming a historian, and I had known of Hughes. I mean, I was familiar with Hughes. I knew who he was, but like most people, I knew him as an aviator or an eccentric. I mean, that was the two things I knew. I knew he was fabulously wealthy, and those were the two things that kind of defined his career. But what I thought was interesting when I read the biography is I really wasn't aware of his tenure as a motion picture producer. And I knew a little bit about Hollywood, so it kind of surprised me a little bit. And as a historian, I'm always fascinated by stories that were once really, really popular, that were in the public imagination, but that have disappeared over time. And I thought, wow, this is one of those examples. Wouldn't it be great if someone wrote a book on something like this related to it? And then I was lucky enough, I went to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, to do some postgraduate work. And at the time, they had a lot of Howard Hughes's records. Howard Hughes's company, which was called the Summa Corporation for many years, I think it's called the Howard Hughes Corporation again, they ended up in Vegas, and they gave a lot of the business records, especially those that did not relate to construction and community building, which is what the Howard Hughes Corporation does today, they gave them to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I found these records that no one had gone through. There was no finding aid, and I spent about 2 years just sitting in that archive reading these old things, reading the telegraphs, the actual telegraphs, because they were all from Hughes's collection. So it was not just a copy. I mean, it was the actual telegraph. I remember coming across one of Katharine Hepburn's contracts for Philadelphia Story. I mean, it was just amazing, the types of things, but it really peeled back the layer. So what I tried to do with the book was just use primary sources, because one of the things that you come to find, and this is a mistake I made early on in my examination of Hughes, so much misinformation gets reprinted and reprinted as fact that over time, that's how the interpretation of Hughes has been established. When I wrote my master's thesis, I don't think my advisor's in here, when I wrote my master's thesis, I made some comments in there that I now realize were inaccurate, especially about how RKO dissolved and it goes into the RKO corporate shell. I didn't have a fuller picture of that, and using the knowledge I had in the secondhand books on RKO, I came to find out the information was wrong. So it was really fantastic. So it was a story that I thought was interesting and unique. It kind of stuck with me. And then when I discovered that archive at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, it was like, and it gave me the opportunity to tell a story using primary documents, to give Hughes his own voice in this story. So that was really exciting. And that's what I think is interesting about the book. It's not a regurgitation of secondhand sources and other books. It is using those primary documents to directly tell the story. The one thing you have to do with Hughes is you got to wade through the fiction, though. Because you can't just take what Hughes said in a newspaper for fact, because he would blatantly lie. So it was finding those contradictions where on one hand, he's putting out a press release saying Hell's Angels made $2 million. The next, I'm reading a description of a ledger, and it's showing it lost $1.5 million. So it was bridging those gaps. And that's why, again, no one had done that with this particular topic. And I'm still excited about it. I still think it's a very interesting topic that I think will have more legs. And I think the 6 people who've bought the book were also very, very interested in it. They loved it. They really did.
I know this is certainly not the thrust of your thesis and the glamour energy of it, but I kept seeing seeds of what we now call the attention economy. Mm-hmm. And when you said, just then, you said something about there's more to tell here, like it's such an exciting, so rich and so exciting, and so I don't know, I wonder if you were to do another book, would that be too boring a side trip to take? Or?
No, I don't think so. The one thing that's interesting about Hughes is there is a lot of literature on Hughes. I mean, there's a book that's written about his time with TWA. There's a book that's written about his time as a casino mogul. So all of those other thoughts and parts have been, written about and talked about. So that's what I thought was interesting about this part was, again, there just hadn't been much attention to it. So I don't know what that next book may be. I'm not sure.
I've spent a lot of time at places like the Harry Ransom Center where they have the big film archives and things like that. Has anyone ever ventured out to curate an exhibit of some of those things? And if not, maybe you should, because I think that would be fascinating to see some of this on display.
One of the things that I realized in preparing for this lecture, which I had not realized, is that archive has now finally been transcribed. There's a finding aid for it. It's on the UNLV's website. So I'm hoping, I don't know, because it's been a few years since I was at UNLV, that this is now getting out there a little bit more. And I would hope if they had those records, they could create a really fantastic exhibit there at UNLV in their film department and really showcase this. They've done an online exhibit about Hughes in general, and they really kind of focus on Hughes's time in Vegas. But I agree with you, it makes for a fascinating thing. Not too long ago as well, some of Hughes's personal effects, the jacket he was known to wear, his hat, and a few other things came up for auction. But I think over the years, a lot of that stuff has gone in a variety of places. The other great place to find these resources, the Margaret Herrick Library, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in Los Angeles, the American Film Institute had a lot of great archives as well, and just going to those individual state and local censorship boards. So it's a lot of different places. But I think an exhibit on Howard Hughes would be absolutely fantastic. I don't know if he ever came to the McFaddin-Ward House, but I'll try to, I'm not sure. There was one, this gentleman right here, this gentleman.
I was really interested in the fact that Katharine Hepburn would be interested in Howard Hughes and Spencer Tracy. I mean, those are two completely different types of people.
And they did. They had an on and off relationship, a very serious relationship for many years. And it was in kind of Hughes was a little bit younger then. If you remember in the movie, there's a telling scene in the movie. I don't know if it's true or not. But if there's a telling scene in the movie where Hughes is a germaphobe. And there's a scene, they're flying a plane together, Hughes and Katharine Hepburn, and he loved milk. He would always have a glass of milk and a steak for dinner. Every night, glass of milk and steak. And they show in the movie, while he's piloting the plane, he drinks his milk, and then he hands it to her to drink it. And he's a germaphobe. Like, this just shows like how much he thinks about her, that he would allow her to drink out of his glass. Again, I don't know if it's an actually true story, but it's interesting to show that they did have a very loving relationship at one point. Got a question over here? We'll get one or two more.
This is more in the area of speculation. This week, we mark the passing of Robert Redford, and one of the biggest achievements of his life is the support of the independent film. Do you see, any connection? Did they ever meet, or did he play any role?
No, Redford was a good guy who was philanthropic, so I see no connection between Howard Hughes and Robert Redford. Again, Hughes was an independent producer, not by choice, but because he had to be. And the moment that he was able to become part of the establishment, he still acted as that thing. So it's hard to determine what would have happened. The studio system would have ended eventually. I mean, that was going to come to an end, but it could have taken years, decades for it to do so. So it's hard to determine independent producers, the impact Hughes really had, because he was such an outlier. I mean, it's just impossible to say because Hughes was an independent, he opened up the doors for other independents. It simply wasn't the case, because they simply could not do what he could do. So it's really hard to kind of determine that aspect of it. But that's another area when they talk about independent production. There was a fantastic book written a few years ago, and they never mentioned Hughes. He's always removed from the story, but he was the definition of an independent producer, even if he was the exception and not the rule. I think we have time for one more question right there.
Do you have any ideas about his connection with the CIA and the Glomar Explorer? And are you planning on doing a book on that?
There is actually a book on that. So what he's talking about, there's a submarine that actually, it's the submarine, right? Broke up, it's in the ocean, and they were the CIA wanted to recover it, but they didn't have the technical expertise to do so. So they worked with Hughes to ultimately get it out of the ocean.
He made the ship, the Glomar Explorer, with a moon pool, and they went down and picked up pieces.
There's a lot of it. DirecTV is an offshoot of Hughes Electronics. You see Hughes' name. You see HughesNet, internet in rural places, Howard Hughes. So you still see his name connected in a lot of these things. And the Howard Hughes Corporation, which does still exist today, they primarily do planned communities and entertainment districts. So you still see his name pop up as well. But there is, I don't know the story, but if you look it up, sir, there is actually a book that has been written on that I believe was very well received. So like I said, just about any part of his career you may be interested in, there's probably a book that has been written on it. There really has. Well, with that, I want to thank you all for coming out this evening. A reminder that our next lecture is on Thursday, October 9th at 6:30, Stories of the 1900 Galveston Storm, What We Have Learned by Shelley Kelly and Judge Jeff Brannick. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all for coming out.